Hey all, this is my general overview of Mythic plus Underrot from the POV of a Casting Mistweaver. I've tried to note where I like my cooldowns, which mobs to prioritize for CCs and interrupts, and commonly unavoided damage that we shouldn't have to heal through but probably will. Ticks stack a bleed on the tank, but they also blow up on death, dealing unavoidable group damage. On higher keys or fortified weeks, if your DPS is killing them evenly, you might want everyone to pop a defensive, or try and wedge Sheilun's Gift or Revival in between tick deaths. Otherwise, staggering their deaths might be a strategy. Matrons will occasionally charge a ranged player, and from that new position they'll begin casting Savage Cleave, a frontal that applies a massive bleed dot to anyone hit. Everyone, including the primary target, can and should dodge this. They also cast War Cry, which buffs other mobs nearby with increased haste, making some abilities a lot more dangerous and harder to interrupt if pulled with a matron. Maggots will cast Rotten Bile in a random direction. This is a narrow frontal breath that ticks extremely fast and can easily kill you. Conventional interrupts do not work, but you can stun or CC this to prevent it. It can be hard to see which direction the maggot is facing if you're not already looking for it. Just remember it's always faced where a player is, so you can always move to a side of the maggot that no players were at when the cast began. Priests are likely top of your kill priority, and you'll want interrupts for two of their most important casts, Gift of Ga'Hoon and Dark Reconstitution. Gift of Ga'Hoon is a buff on another mob that makes them unkillable for 20 seconds, and Dark Reconstitution is just a heal. These are quick casts though, especially if they have the haste buff from the Matron's War Cry, so try and get what you can. Headhunters will net a random player with Hooked Snare, which is a root with a bleed. Especially on high fortified keys, the targets of Hooked Snare will need a lot of healer attention, or Tiger's Lust to clear it entirely. They'll also throw spears at random players for moderate damage. Normally I wouldn't talk about skips, but this was always a pretty popular spot to invis through. One side will have a stationary matron, which has True Sight, which prevents you from invis potting past them. The side without this stationary matron will have a patrol consisting of a priest, headhunter, and matron. I'm guessing most groups are going to pick the side with the patrol. They'll kill the trio, and then they'll invis past the platform all the way to the boss. This patrol can be deadly if the matron charges a player netted by the headhunter, since the net will prevent them from dodging her Savage Cleave. So either prevent the Hooked Snare cast with CCs, or have Tiger's Lust ready for whoever gets picked. Just be ready in case you're stuck healing through someone who gets the massive bleed dot. If you decide to fight the pack with the Befouled Spirit, you'll have to heal through Dark Omen, which is a channeled dot focused on a random player that also pulses a bit of splash damage to anyone near them. Your group will also have to interrupt Harrowing Despair, which is just a group-wide nuke if it's allowed to go off. The Spirit comes with other mobs that are already doing a lot of group damage, so I wouldn't recommend fighting this pack, but pick whatever you're comfortable with. Elder Leaxa spams Bloodbolt, which should be interrupted, and frequently teleports to a player to cast Sanguine Feast, a quick AoE cast that nukes anyone still in its radius when it goes off. Any damage taken by her abilities triggers Taint of Ga'Hoon, a dot that persists until you've countered the healing negation that comes with it. Whenever she casts Creeping Rot, she'll face a random direction and shoot out a wave of rot, dealing massive damage to anyone caught in its path. This gets pretty dangerous when you're dealing with multiple images of her casting all at the same time. Speaking of these images, Leaxa casts Blood Mirror, which spawns a mirror image that casts the same spells as her. Ideally, you'll be killing them off quick enough that you won't have to deal with more than one at a time, but either way you'll want to be ready to heal through any casts that go off and any avoidable damage taken from either Sanguine Feast or Creeping Rot. Moving on to the next trash, Living Rot will cast Wave of Decay, which spawns a green swirl for you to dodge. Lashers try to cast Decaying Mind, which you should always interrupt or CC to prevent, otherwise it triggers a long stun on a single target. However, you can dispel this if it's on someone else. Blood Swarmers will fixate on a random player, and if you can't kite them, you probably want a powerful defensive to survive their melee hits, especially on fortified weeks. Realistically, don't be surprised if melee DPS try and test the limits of your ability to keep them up through damage, since running away is rarely their favorite option. Blood Swarmers also try to cast Sonic Screech, which does light group damage and interrupts anyone casting when it goes off, so keep an eye out for that. Cragmaw can be a tough fight to heal through, depending on how your group handles its mechanics and positioning. He'll occasionally charge at a random player, and anyone in its path needs to sidestep quickly to dodge. This spawns larvae on the floor that you can run over just before they turn into adds. If your tank brings the boss near a wall, the rest of your group can bait the charge towards the wall so that he goes a shorter distance, which is better for DPS uptime. He also casts Indigestion, which is just a small frontal cast at the tank that deals massive damage. Try and keep your tank topped off, especially on higher keys where a tank caught without mitigation can easily be killed by a 1-2 punch from Indigestion, then an auto attack, or vice versa. Shortly after hitting 100 energy, Cragmaw will go into a tantrum for 6 seconds, dealing massive group damage and spawning larvae all over the place as he runs around the room. On high keys or on a tyrannical week, unless your group comp has extremely low mobility, I'd recommend focusing on healing rather than chasing down larvae. As long as your group quickly spreads to cover different parts of the room, they should be able to get most, if not all, of the larvae before they turn into adds. Just make sure that once everybody goes to soak the larvae, that you're within healing range of them, which means you might want to drift towards the center a little bit after the boss hits 100 energy. I try and alternate Shaloon's Gift and Unbound to cover these tantrums, but it couldn't hurt to also start putting hots on people just before Cragmaw hits 100 energy, since his tantrum does a lot of damage in those 6 seconds, and you simply don't have enough time to set up once it's begun. Any larvae that successfully grow into ticks behave just like the ones at the beginning of the dungeon, stacking a bleed on the tank and exploding for group damage on death. In most cases, this will be manageable since the boss mostly does avoidable damage during his regular phase, but if too many ticks evolve, things can get out of hand really quickly. On to the next trash. Fallen Death Speakers will try and cast Wicked Frenzy to give another mob a haste buff. This is worth interrupting. They also cast Wicked Embrace on random players, which is just a magic debuff that you'll be dispelling practically on cooldown. Grotesque Horrors are stationary worms that spam death bolts, but more importantly, they'll try and cast Dark Echoes, which you want to interrupt, otherwise it's a lot of group damage. Especially while people are still learning the roots, someone might aggro a Grotesque Horror behind or in front of where your group is fighting, in which case you might have to heal through several of their casts before your group can get it under control, probably with a major cooldown like Shaloon or Unbound. Bloodsworn Defilers cast a few dangerous spells. First, they channel Withering Curse, which increases everyone's damage taken and reduces their damage done. This is definitely the priority interrupt. They'll also cast Shadowbolt Volley, which is just a group-wide burst of damage if you fail to interrupt. This is probably healable to an extent, but when you fight the double Defiler pack before the third boss, I would try and have Shaloons ready in case one volley goes off, since the second one going off is likely a wipe if you haven't recovered from the first. Lastly, they'll spawn Spirit Drain Totems, which deal massive damage to anyone within 6 yards of the totem after a few seconds. Technically, the totems can be killed, but it's so much easier and less risky to just move away from them. Sporecaller Zancha is very similar to Laymore in Azure Vault. You'll want to make sure all of the Boundless Rot spores are destroyed before he reaches full energy and casts Festering Harvest, which explodes any that are left over. The tank destroys several of these at a time with the boss's frontal shockwave, which also means don't stand in front of the boss. Random players are picked for Upheaval, which creates a small quake under their feet when it expires. The idea is they bring it to the space between several spores, then walk out of it once it spawns, allowing it to destroy any spores that it overlaps onto. Hopefully your group can drop these quakes between and overlapping on the spores, instead of running face first into them. While people are still learning, just be prepared for a bit of mess. If I can manage it while healing normally, as a Mistweaver I like to clear a lot of extra spores, since running over these spores puts a disease dot on that you can dispel. For example, I might run over 2 spores quickly, dispel myself, and repeat both steps once my dispel is back off cooldown. If there are a lot of spores remaining and the boss is about to hit 100 energy, I might cocoon myself or diffuse magic so I can run through 3, 4, maybe even 5 spores before dispelling myself. But even through the defensive, the dot really hurts. So if you try this, make sure you clear your 2, 3, or 4 spores extremely fast, and then dispel before the ticking damage kills you. If the boss is allowed to explode any spores, this will trigger a burst of group-wide damage and a disease dot, with the damage and debuff stacks based on how many were left over. It's not ideal, but if everyone pops defensives, Revival could instantly dispel the dot portion if everyone survives the initial hit. On the other hand, if you're well coordinated but somehow completely overrun by spores and he's about to hit 100 energy, you can have your whole group go and soak 2 or 3 spores each, all at the same time, and then Revival to dispel all their dots at once. I didn't mention this before, but whenever spores are cleared by Upheaval or Festering Harvest, Blight Balls shoot out in every direction from them, dealing damage and applying stacks of the disease dot to anyone hit. This is where a lot of the avoidable group damage is going to happen, and it's this messiness that can make it difficult to balance regular healing with self-dispelling to clear extra spores. Of this last trash, the only new mobs are the Faceless Corruptors, which cast only 2 things. Abyssal Reach spawns tentacles under players' feet that lash out after a few seconds, so you want to move away from these as soon as they spawn. Try and spawn these in the same place as a group if you can, so that everyone can move together to safety, without worrying about dodging out of one set into another. These faceless mobs also cast Maddening Gaze, a frontal that does massive damage and fears anyone hit. Basically, stay grouped up to bait the Abyssal Reach tentacles, repositioning for those as well as the frontal gaze. The Unbound Abomination does constant group damage with Putrid Blood, which is just a dot that stacks passively. You can dispel some of this, but for the most part, you'll be clearing it as a group by standing in Cleansing Light, which is applied to a random player and clears all stacks from anyone inside after a few seconds. All the while, the boss will be casting Vile Expulsion periodically, which targets a random player and winds up a frontal breath, dealing massive damage to anyone still standing in the front and dropping a bunch of blighted ground around him and in that area. Ideally, you'll bait expulsions toward the wall, moving together to dodge and moving around the outside of the room. Just watch out for early runners, since they can easily accidentally bait the expulsion in the direction your group is expecting to travel, which can end up being disastrous. In the footage I'm using, you can tell that we're positioned terribly and baiting the expulsions even worse, so don't do it like this. And that's my overview of this dungeon. I plan to make similar videos for the other dungeons as I gather enough gameplay footage, so stay tuned for those if you found this one useful. Until next time, thanks so much for watching, and have a good one.